Hello, and welcome to the Alternate History Class Podcast. My name is Andrew, and here I explore alternate history through the lens of a history class from an alternate timeline. Last week we looked at how both nations reacted to the South's victory in the Civil War. This week we look at the crisis of 1880. Now, the crisis of 1880 was a fruit of manifest destiny. The concept that America was destined to control the American continents and stretch from sea to shining sea, as the saying goes. The Confederacy saw themselves as Americans and had no reason to not hold the same grounds of expanding from sea to sea. And so, to reach the Pacific Ocean, they obviously couldn't go in a straight line because they had already ceded their claims to New Mexico and Arizona, and even if they had them, they wouldn't be able to get California from the United States without a war. So deciding to go a more diplomatic route, instead of trying to fight their way to the Pacific, they entered into negotiations with the Mexican Empire for the states of Sonora and Chihuahua. And on January 28th of 1880, they came to an agreement to purchase the two territories for $20 million. Now, the U.S. was not happy. The one small concession they had from losing the Civil War was that the Confederacy was kind of stuck in the southeast, stuck along the Gulf of Mexico. But with this purchase, now they could be a two-seas power just like the United States was. So the United States issued immediate diplomatic protest. This was ignored by the Confederacy as they didn't see any reason to acknowledge the U.S. issues. As far as they were concerned, the U.S. was just whining and complaining about something. And they hadn't done anything since the end of the War of Succession. Why would they start now? The Confederacy started moving troops and officials in on February 4th, which caused the U.S. to issue a second diplomatic protest to this. But this did not stop the Confederacy from continuing to move in. And with these protests ignored, President Grant ordered the mobilization of the U.S. Army of the West and the Army of the Potomac as tensions reached a boiling point on February 11th. If the U.S. was going to be ignored when it tried to protest the purchase diplomatically, then it was going to force its will on the Confederacy if it had to. Now, President Johnson did not take this lying down. He mobilized the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of West Texas to go sit on the border across from the U.S. troops. Now, this state of affairs lasted for about 2 days before both powers received calls from their ambassadors from the German Empire, as on February 13th, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck would call for a meeting between diplomats from the two nations to try to solve this issue peacefully before the two nations actually started their second war with each other. And he volunteered to host the talks in Hamburg. Now, this cooled tensions a little as both sides considered the offer, which they would accept on February 16th, as both sides sent diplomatic parties to Hamburg, along with diplomatic parties from the Mexican Empire and the United Kingdom, who were also invited by Bismarck. Now, Bismarck was not just doing this out of the goodness of his heart. he saw an opportunity to get the German Empire an ally across the sea, someone who could counterbalance the French ally in the Confederacy if the two nations ever came back to war, which is why France was not invited to these talks, as tended to be the pattern for when Bismarck wanted to make international negotiations. He intentionally would leave out France. Now, these talks officially began on February 23rd and would last until October 29th. Now, obviously, the U.S.'s primary issues were with the purchases of Sonora and Chihuahua. They didn't think that this was legitimate. They didn't want the Confederacy to reach the Pacific. But they also had their eye on the Mexican province of Baja California and wanted that. They had wanted the territories which were directly below, for the most part, New Mexico and Arizona territories. And they were, for a lack of a better term, sore losers in a way. They felt that they had missed out on their opportunity. The Confederacy obviously wanted their purchases, their expansion, to be recognized by the international community. As stated before, Germany wanted to negotiate something that would get the U.S. to view them as a partner, as an ally in the international community. So the U.S. had been relatively diplomatically isolated in a way, with the British and the French having sided with the Confederacy. The Mexicans, in reality, little better than a French and Confederate puppet. And Canada, obviously, at the time, being part of the British Empire. The British now were interested in doing something that their public had been kind of pressing them to do. While the British were happy to have socked one to the United States back in the 1860s, the Confederacy was still a slave state, and that did not sit right with the very anti-slavery British public. The British public had been pressuring the government to either cut ties with the Confederacy, which the government had no interest in doing, or to get the Confederacy to outlaw slavery. So the British wanted to use this opportunity to get the Confederacy to get rid of their slaves. They would leverage their diplomatic weight to get what their public wanted, to strike a major political win at home. And Mexico was here because, well, the land was being purchased from Mexico. Now, these debates were furious. They were intense. For the first several weeks, the U.S. was not willing to recognize the purchases, and it looked for a few times that those armies which were still sitting on the borders would soon come to blows. But Bismarck, the master diplomat that he was able to sit down with the U.S. Secretary of State, William Evarts, and was able to work out that the U.S. had wanted to purchase some of these northern territories from Mexico themselves. So in a separate talk, a couple of days later, he got the Mexican Empire to agree to sell Baja California to the United States in exchange for the United States recognizing the purchase of Sonora and Chihuahua. Now, this wasn't exactly what the U.S. had wanted, but it was still a major win for the U.S. to get Baja California, as it was the goal at the time of every U.S. presidency and administration to expand the country in some way, especially after losing a large chunk of the nation. Now, the CSA felt pretty comfortable coming into these negotiations. They didn't think that Germany was going to be hostile. But what they were caught off guard by was, in the early weeks, the United Kingdom's push for them to emancipate their slaves. The British threatened to back the United States in viewing the purchase of Sonora and the purchase of Chihuahua as illegitimate. The Confederacy, not knowing of any of the backdoor dealings at this point of Bismarck, was forced to agree to this term. And the United States viewed this in many ways as a win. They were getting a term from the Confederacy that they had never really expected to get. And so the Confederacy would agree to emancipate their slaves, with all children of slaves born the day after the treaty was ratified by the Confederate Congress to be legally free and not the property of the owner of their parents. It was also at this point in which the USNCS decided to preempt any future diplomatic issues while they were at the table. They decided to also use this opportunity to extend the U.S.'s use of their docks at New Orleans, preemptively extending it by an additional 25 years, which would leave the renewal to be in 1909. And as these talks went on, as rumors started to leak, public sentiment in the U.S. just grew more and more as the U.S. finally felt that it was getting one over on the Confederacy, getting one over on what many called the Rebs. But in the CSA, things were quite the opposite. Rumors started to swirl that the Confederacy, under diplomatic pressure, would have to agree to terms that slavery, which many still living veterans of the War of Secession had fought for and had lost limb for, and many had lost their lives for, the protection of, would be eradicated, which put much negative sentiment and fear in the Confederacy of what was going to happen with the newly emancipated slaves. There was no way in their eyes that the black man could be viewed as the same as the white man. In their eyes, they were legitimately, biologically, and in all ways, better than the black man. This would destroy the legacy of the former general turned president, Stonewall Jackson. And when the terms came out, the U.S. was jubilant, the Confederacy was enraged. The official terms had the U.S. recognizing the purchase of Sonora and Chihuahua as legitimate, but also the Mexican Empire agreeing to sell Baja California to the U.S. for $11 million, as had been negotiated by Bismarck. The Confederacy would agree to the gradual emancipation of their slaves, with all who were currently slaves born before the independence of the nation would remain slaves until their death. All who were born after would remain slaves for another 20 years. And all children born after the Hamburg Agreement was ratified by the Confederate Congress would be born free, would be the first blacks born in the Confederacy who were not the owners of their parents' property. And tacked on kind of at the end, the extension of the lease of the port of New Orleans being extended to 1909. Now, when it came to how this affected things domestically in the United States, Grant crushed the Democrats' sacrificial lamb of Winfield, Hancock, in an absolutely dominating victory. This was viewed as a massive diplomatic and international win for the U.S., as this was announced October 29th, just in time for Election Day, to guarantee Grant's victory. In the Confederacy, this did not end the mainstream Democrats' reign in the Confederate president's mansion, as Jackson's vice president, John B. Gordon, would defeat the Jacksonian candidate, Isham G. Harris. But it was a narrow victory when it came to the Confederate Electoral College. It would be a sign of things to come for the political battle in the Confederacy for the next 20 years. Now, both would ratify the Hamburg Agreement. There was more controversy in the Confederacy, obviously. The U.S. would ratify it on January 18th of 1881, while the Confederates wouldn't ratify it until February 4th. This would, in many ways, set the stage for the end of the century, what many in America would call the Great Rebound, and what many in the Confederacy would call the era of growing pains. And that is what we will look at next week. Thank you for checking out the Alternate History class on YouTube. If you enjoyed this week's episode, feel free to like the video, and if you want to see each video when it goes live, subscribe and hit that bell. The Alternate History class can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find podcasts. Big thank you to my patrons. If you'd like to support the show, you become a patron, and if you're in the top 2 tiers, you'll get a shout out at the end of each episode after you sign up. Thank you for your most important donation, your time, and I'll see you next time as we journey down the path not taken.